This is it, Truth Sleuths. This is the final part of the Toy Box Killer case, and we've already discussed so much more than I had expected. As of the last video, David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy were arrested, interrogated, and arraigned for their inhumane treatment of several different women. Hendy had already flipped on Ray and turned witness of the prosecution to save herself from the overwhelming amount of punishment she was facing if found guilty in a court of law. Today, we see this horrid case to its end and follow up on what has become of the Quartet of Doom. One last time, let's take a look inside the case files of the Toy Box Killer, David Parker Ray. While Hendy and David Parker Ray were undergoing the beginning of their condemnation, Jessie Ray decided it would be a good idea to return to her father's side in a vain attempt to exonerate him, even after being advised not to by FBI agents. Many of Ray's family refused to believe that he could truly be as evil as reports had claimed. Ray was placed in solitary confinement to keep him away from those within the jail that would sooner kill him than allow him to live the rest of his life in prison, let alone allow him to live long enough to see the end of his trial. He did nothing but spend time trying to ensure a not guilty verdict, including foolishly smuggling letters to Hendy professing his undying devotion to a woman he was unaware had already abandoned him. Unlike his other 3 cohorts, Yancey was taking every step to hide from any responsibility for his own part in the disgusting events I've already described to you. He dyed his hair and grew facial hair, only giving any hint of how deplorable he truly was in certain situations with only his closest of confidants, so that it would come off as a joke instead of a confession. Even though he took such painstaking efforts to quell his paranoia, Yancey was picked up by New Mexico State Police Special Agents Wesley LaCuesta and Carlos Martinez before grilling him about Marie Parker and his involvement in the crimes against her. He ended up confessing to the murder and claiming that he performed the act under duress from Hendy and Ray, officially being booked for the crime that same evening and held without bond. Though they were led to where Parker's body had been dumped by Yancey, they were unable to recover it. His involvement was confirmed once again when his own wife received the same confession from him. Yancey pled not guilty, just as Ray had, at his arraignment, and endured his own wife's testimony to his confession at the hearing. Hendy would later sign a plea deal and plead guilty to 2 first-degree felony charges of kidnapping, 2 second-degree felony charges of criminal penetration, and conspiracy to kidnap after speaking with her legal counsel, receiving a prison sentence of 20 to 54 years in prison with $60,000 in fines for her testimony against David Parker Ray. Interestingly enough, this only got released to the press later due to clerical error that did not officially seal them as court ordered. On April 16th, the investigation was expanded from 3 states to 5 due to the identification of Billy Ray Bowers' body, David Parker Ray the prime suspect this time around as the investigation was reopened. A 2-day hearing was held in order to determine if the Bowers case should be taken to trial, where media was once again exposed to just how dark the investigations into Ray's depravity were, with testimony from both Montano and Vigil. Testimony was also given from Darlene Breach, the woman whose trailer Vigil ran to after her escape, as well as Lynn Cummings, the nurse who treated Vigil after she was rescued by emergency personnel, and John Briscoe, the New Mexico State criminal investigator who began the initial investigation into the Bass Road property. Though his defense attempted to dismiss all charges under failure to meet the burden of proper cause, the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence for a trial within 6 months on all charges, and that a bond of $1 million be put in place. While the media and most of the investigation was focused on the preliminary hearing for Ray, Yancey, and Hendy, New Mexico State Police Criminal Supervisor Casey Rogers finally got in contact with Kelly Van Cleve and traveled to Colorado to interview her. The confirmation of the tattoo seen in the found footage and her interview with investigators was enough to have Jessie Ray arrested April 26th and charged with 12 counts of kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, and conspiracy to kidnap Van Cleve. Jessie was also placed under $1 million bond and faced up to 150 years in prison and a $140,000 fine total. Finally, all 4 bad actors were arrested and facing a steep penance for their crimes. The case continued to gain media traction, and investigators continued to become more frustrated as they had still, 5 weeks after David Parker Ray and Hendy's arrests, had yet to find a body for any suspected crimes. Jessie sat alone on her preliminary hearing May 11th for her charges in the Kelly Van Cleve case, her father having waived his right to said hearing. Those who testified included Sergeant Rogers, Janet Murphy, and a retelling of the events for which the Rays stand accused by Kelly Van Cleve herself. This was also a very infamous hearing because for the first time, the disgusting introductory tape I covered in the first video of the series was played for all in the courtroom to hear. Just hearing the recording once was enough to make reporters who had followed the case since the start quit covering it altogether. The judge ruled that Jessie would stand trial for all charges and, due to the previous clerical error, personally ensured that all pertinent records were sealed. The very next day, Assistant DA Jim Yount confirmed for the first time publicly that there was an active investigation into the alleged crimes of the Rays, Hendy, and Yancey. This interview also released extremely specific findings regarding the FBI's investigation. The FBI had this to say about Ray's sadistic sexual fantasies. A review of David Parker Ray's activities, including the extensive collection of materials maintained by him, suggests that he exhibits characteristics of a preferential sex offender and more specifically a sexual sadist. The profilers believed it likely that Ray had kept mementos from his victims, including jewelry, hair or fingernails, to later relive his experiences. Cindy Hendy, they thought, was a sexual masochist who willingly suffered pain and humiliation. Ray, on the other hand, was a sadist who was sexually aroused by the intense suffering of his victims. Sexual fantasies or acts may involve activities that indicate the dominance of the person over the victim, e.g., forcing the victim to crawl or keeping the victim in a cage. They may also involve restraint, blindfolding, paddling, spanking, whipping, pinching, beating, burning, electrical shocks, rape, cutting, stabbing, strangulation, torture, mutilation, or killing. Some individuals with sexual sadism may engage in sadistic acts for many years without the need to increase the potential for inflicting serious physical damage. Usually, however, the severity of sadistic acts increase over time. Individuals with sexual sadism may seriously injure or kill their victims. Yount would file to have the Rays tried together, but this was overshadowed by the resurfacing of the FBI's incompetence with the fact that Jessie reported her father's activity in June 1986, arguably making her the greatest victim of his depravity in the public eye. While there were attempts to squash this rumor by DA Ron Lopez, it only further fueled conspiracy theories that Jessie's part in her father's criminal activity was against her own will. Investigators continued to be disappointed when a burlap sack filled with human flesh and bone was found floating in the north end of Elephant Butte Lake. Turned out to be too water damaged to test on June 30th, 1999. During the subsequent months of the investigation prior to their trial, the Rays continued to try and persuade Hendy to stop cooperating with law enforcement. David Parker Ray even went as far as to get Hendy's name tattooed on his arm and sent her a picture, sending her letters until she started to soften up and take his side once again. On July 1st, Jessie's defense team attempted to remove the presiding judge in the case to possibly get someone less invested, along with hiring a PI to find evidence that would clear her name and get her exonerated of her transgressions against Van Cleve. Yancey was also being investigated during this time for the mysterious suicide of Kenneth Lee Lane, but this was once again closed after a month due to lack of evidence to bring him to trial. On August 25th, the motion to remove the presiding judge was dismissed, and it was determined that the Rays would be tried separately, with the judge stating that they could change their mind at any time. On December 2nd, Yancey signed a plea deal to second-degree murder and first-degree conspiracy to commit murder in the case of Marie Parker, receiving 20 years in prison with 2 years of parole in exchange for his testimony against David Parker Ray. While Yancey had taken his punishment, Hendy was trying to get her plea and disposition agreement overturned, along with attempting to get married to Ray. While she changed her legal counsel, the prosecution pushed to have her sentenced in accordance with her signed plea agreement. After a special hearing on January 14, 2000, Hendy's attempt to retract her plea deal was denied at the cost of her cooperation and the prosecution's most damning witness against David Parker Ray. This was not the last blow the prosecution would endure, as David Parker Ray's defense attorney, Jeff Rain, would file a flurry of motions that would attempt to delay the trial as long as possible, and split David's trial into 3 for each of the victims instead of 1. This pissed the DA off because it was going to be hard enough to get a decent enough jury for 1 trial due to how publicly scrutinized the case was, let alone 4. Unfortunately for them, the presiding judge had granted these motions, and it was confirmed that there would be 3 trials for David Parker Ray alone, with a 4th for Jesse Ray in possibly different locations, the first for David being set for May 28, 2000 in Tierra Amarilla. This first trial, which was for the charges regarding Cindy Vigil, was dubbed the trial of torture by the media, and things started extremely badly, with not only David Parker Ray's initial interviews being suppressed, but all media being banned from the jury selection process. What's worse is 3 days prior to the trial, David Ray appeared in court with a heart monitor due to 4 prior trips to Sierra Vista Hospital for heart troubles that resulted in him being rushed to Memorial Medical Center in Las Cruces with a suspected heart attack the next day. David Ray was discharged from the hospital the afternoon of the trial, but it was postponed further due to the prosecution filing to overturn decisions to exclude key evidence. 5 expert witnesses in the fields of DNA, violent crime, and hair were excluded from testifying on top of the early interviews already being excluded. To move things along more quickly, the presiding judge decided to start the second trial before the first. On May 7th, Angelica Montano died of pneumonia at the age of 25 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, being put to rest at the very same time Hendy was being sentenced for her torture. Hendy was sentenced to 27 years for her crimes against Montano and another 36 for those against Vigil, her sentence being reduced to 36 total due to both running simultaneously. Though her lawyer tried to withdraw her guilty plea on the grounds of mental handicap, the presiding judge blocked that attempt. Vigil was able to address Hendy for both herself and Montano, telling her former captor to rot in hell. During the jury selection process for the second trial regarding the crimes against Kelly Van Cleve, the defense filed to have all photographs of the toy box, along with all equipment and accessories seized from the Ray property, excluded. Selection ended up taking 12 days due to most jurors questioned already being familiar with the case via media coverage and had prior bias towards David Parker Ray. On June 26, the prosecution filed with the state Supreme Court to clear the issues with evidence and witness testimony before jurors were officially sworn in, claiming that the lack of follow-through reflected badly upon New Mexico's image of justice and opened more avenues for a mistrial. The Supreme Court agreed with the prosecution, and the presiding judge ruled to have the evidence in question excluded, which was the following: the introductory audio tape, the checklist of how to handle victims, and pictures of the torture equipment, guns, and knives. During the first trial, the prosecution made their opening and closing statements, and at recess, Ray was taken for medical treatment by EMTs due to his theatrics and complaints of chest pains during the proceedings. Ray returned a few hours later with medicine, a supply of nitro, and an oxygen tank to hear the defense's statements, presumably to garner sympathy from the jury. Ray continued his theatrics the next day, with the trial resuming for day 3 on July 5th, with the video footage taken of Van Cleve's traumatic experience being played for the jury, followed by a disposition from her former husband. A mistrial was requested and denied the 4th day, just before Van Cleve took the stand to recount her own harrowing ordeal. Day 5 was a whole other ballpark because the jury was subjected to countless photographs and physical evidence before the customized torture bench was set up directly in front of where they sat so they could visualize where Van Cleve had been kept. Van Cleve's psychotherapist, David Allen Spencer, holder of a master's degree in social work and private practice owner in Colorado since 1995, had to testify as to his validity as an expert witness. The next day of trial resumed, with Spencer taking the stand to discuss the level of trauma Van Cleve experienced after her kidnapping and torture, though he was called out on not knowing that the resistance to having sexual intercourse with their current husband went back to her marriage at the time of the Ray incident. His testimony ended the prosecution's case. The defense did not call any witnesses, and the trial deferred to the jury for deliberation. After closing statements were made and several viewings of the videotape of Van Cleve's torture, the jury could not come to a unanimous verdict, and a mistrial was called on July 13, 2000. This was not without some major revelations on the part of both sides. While law enforcement continued to push forward to find as much evidence to bring the Rays to justice, Rain quit the New Mexico Public Defender's Office and took a job in Antarctica as a defense contractor due to, in my opinion, the sheer depravity of the case he just experienced. Rain was replaced by a new lawyer, Lee Meulen, and the DA decided that the Montana trial would be postponed indefinitely to focus on the Van Cleve and Vigil trials. The retrial proceedings for the Van Cleve case began November 27th, but there was a massive change to the case as the presiding judge up to this point died of a massive heart attack 3 days later. The appeals court stepped in after the presiding judge's death and made a few big decisions in the case, upholding Hendy's conviction and backing the exclusion of late evidence in the initial Van Cleve trial. A new judge, Kevin Swayzea, was appointed as the next judge to preside over the David Parker Ray case and push things forward with a fervor that was not seen with the previous judge March 12, 2001. A new jury was selected by April 4th and the retrial began April 9th, with Van Cleve taking the stand to recount her experience in a much more composed manner. Unlike in the previous trial, the toy box audio tape was admitted into evidence, and it was a definitive turning point that would put a pin in the defense's argument that what happened was consensual. The jury would see the rest of the same evidence the previous trial showed, with McMillan failing to poke and prod witnesses as Rain had to put any bit of doubt in their minds. Once again, the prosecution rested, with the defense bringing no additional witnesses to the stand, and deliberations began April 16th, only lasting 5.5 hours before a verdict was returned: guilty. Guilty on all 12 counts. His second trial over the Cynthia Vigil case began June 18th with testimony from Darlene and Dawn Breach. Vigil was the next person to testify and, understandably, had to take a break partway through her testimony to compose herself, as she recounted the gruesome and gut-wrenching details of what happened to her. She was able to hold out for a short time longer when they returned from the short recess, breaking down once again when she was asked about the part of the torture where she was suspended from the ceiling, having a massive panic attack to the point she needed to be escorted out by paramedics on oxygen. DNA evidence was brought out the next day to show that every bit of Vigil's testimony was supported by tangible proof. This was enough for the defense to go into a death roll to get any sort of leverage and for David Parker Ray to inevitably take a plea deal. Ray agreed to first and second degree charges of kidnapping, sexual penetration, and second degree charge of conspiracy to kidnap, along with waiving any appeals to the previous trial in exchange for the third trial being tabled. Ray still had to appear in federal court and plead to 2 counts of violating the White Slavery Act, however. All of this meant he faced a maximum of 258 years in prison. Even after all of this, Ray still publicly claimed that the toy box was a museum and not a torture chamber, though it was clear how untrue this statement is. Jessie Ray made a plea agreement September 17th and was allowed to walk free on 5 years probation, coming back for her father's sentencing to trash everyone involved on the side of the prosecution. FBI Special Agent and Quantico profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole would testify at the sentencing, stating the following regarding Ray's profile of a criminal sexual sadist. It's a type of sexual dysfunction that incorporates abhorrent sexual behavior. I formed a preliminary opinion that Ray was a criminal sexual sadist. That opinion never wavered. In my years with the FBI, I have interviewed approximately 25 criminal sexual sadists. It is considered a rare behavior. There are no remedies known to scientists to stop this behavior. Van Cleve and Vigil both stated that they wanted Ray to suffer for his crimes for the remainder of his life, as opposed to the finality of death, calling him a sick pervert and describing just how scarred they were from their traumatic experiences. The Attorney General of New Mexico, Patricia Madrid, took the stand and stated the following: "The victims, the court, and our communities have been subjected to untold horrors during the course of this case. David Ray is a criminal sexual sadist. He thrives on violence and psychic trauma. As a community and state, we cannot risk the chance of his freedom. He intends to torment and torture other people as long as the court allows him. He reduced women to slaves. For days and nights, these women were left wondering if they would live or die. On behalf of the state, we are here to ask for the maximum sentence plus aggravation." Jim Yonts, who put so much into this case to see justice served, said this: "It's been over 2.5 years that I had to think about what I was going to say. This monster should never be allowed to roam the streets again. These people don't change. These people aren't amenable to treatment. He picked the wrong victims. He picked the wrong victim in Kelly Van Cleve, who had the guts and intestinal fortitude to testify 3 times in a public forum. He picked the wrong victim in Cindy Vigil. She struggled at the peril of her own well-being to get away. If she hadn't done that, the nightmare would have continued in Truth or Consequences. Under no circumstances should there be a light at the end of the tunnel for David Ray." Finally, the monster himself took the stand and decided to have a pity party. "I cannot change the past, but I can be sorry for what I did. I'm here and I've lost my home, my health, and my property. The years I've spent in a cell have given me time to reflect. It gives me the opportunity to get right with God." Ray received 223 years imprisonment for his crimes, 132 for Kelly Van Cleve, 36 for Cynthia Vigil, and another 56 for aggravation at the behest of the prosecution and the state. David Parker Ray spent the rest of his unnatural life in jail and died there in May 2002. Jessie Ray is still living in Albuquerque, New Mexico as a free woman. Roy Yancey was released on parole in 2011 and has an active Facebook account. Cindy Hendy was released from prison on July 15, 2019 and lives without supervision to this day. I wanted to take the time out to thank my lovely patrons for their support of the channel, Jessica, Debbie, and Mike. Thank you so much for your support, and if you want to become a patron as well and see these videos 24 hours prior to their public release, the link for my Patreon is down below.